The Swiss Alps, January 21st, 2026, two speeches, same venue, less than 24 hours apart. One outlined a vision for how democratic nations navigate a fracturing global order. The other revealed what happens when raw power collides with coordinated resistance. What unfolded at the World Economic Forum this week wasn't just diplomatic theater. It was a stress test of the post-war international system, and the results tell us something fundamental about how power actually works in 2026. Start with Tuesday afternoon. Mark Carney delivered his address at 4:30 p.m. Central European Time, following his prepared remarks with a moderated discussion alongside Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times and Larry Fink of BlackRock. The audience wasn't casual observers. These were people managing trillions in assets, heads of state, CEOs of multinational corporations. When Carney speaks, they listen. His credentials demand it. Former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the only person to ever hold both positions simultaneously. His understanding of global finance and economic power isn't theoretical. Carney opened by declaring the world was experiencing a rupture in the world order, the end of what he called a nice story and the beginning of a brutal reality where geopolitics among great powers is not subject to any constraints, not a transition, a rupture. The word choice was deliberate. This wasn't about gradual change or evolution. It was about something breaking apart irreparably. He referenced a 1978 essay by Václav Havel written when Czechoslovakia was under Soviet control, calling on middle powers to live the truth and recognize that the scaffold of American power on which so much of their security had been built was being abandoned. What made the speech remarkable wasn't the diagnosis. European leaders privately acknowledged the rules-based order is eroding. What distinguished Carney's address was his willingness to state this openly and his refusal to pretend otherwise. He confessed that the international rules-based order had been partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and that international law applied with varied rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This wasn't nostalgia disguised as analysis, it was acknowledgement that the old system was never as principled as its defenders claimed. But Carney didn't stop at critique. He called on middle powers to unite against economic coercion from great powers that have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. His message to countries like France, Germany, Australia, and Canada was stark. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Stand together or be consumed separately. He pledged that other countries, particularly middle powers like Canada, are not powerless and have the capacity to build a new order that embodies values like respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. Then he addressed Greenland directly, opposing the tariffs Trump had threatened, and stating firmly that Canada stands with Greenland and Denmark in their unique right to determine Greenland's future. He called the situation a test of NATO's collective defense commitment. The speech was measured, precise, devastating, and the global reaction was immediate. Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, stated he had never seen a global reaction to a speech like Carney's. Alexander Stubb, president of Finland, called it one of the best speeches heard at Davos that week, praising its profound analysis of the evolving world order and emphasis on values-based realism. Less than 24 hours later, Donald Trump took the same stage. The contrast was immediate. Trump opened with his characteristic mix of humor and menace, addressing friends and a few enemies in the audience. Then he pivoted to Greenland, and what followed exposed the limits of his strategy. For weeks, Trump had escalated systematically, first claiming Greenland was necessary for national security, then refusing to rule out military force, then sending his son on what critics called a publicity stunt, passing out MAGA hats in Nuuk, then appointing a special envoy tasked with making Greenland part of the United States, then threatening Denmark with tariffs, then expanding those threats to 8 European nations. Europe responded by unifying. Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom deployed troops to Greenland for joint military exercises, stating they were not threatening anyone but defending an ally. Emmanuel Macron gave speeches insisting France would not yield to intimidation. Far-right European parties that usually align with Trump pushed back on his Greenland demands. The Danish foreign minister insisted territorial integrity was non-negotiable. Trump had overplayed his hand, and at Davos he needed an exit, so he declared victory. Trump announced that based on a very productive meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, they had formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. And based upon this understanding, he would not be imposing the tariffs scheduled to go into effect on February 1st. Framework of a deal, not a deal. In an interview with CNBC's Joe Kernan, Trump described the Greenland framework as the concept of a deal. The phrasing was telling. When pressed on whether the United States would gain ownership, Trump became evasive. It's complex, he said. That's what you say when you're backing down without admitting it. Here's what actually happened. Trump went to Davos demanding ownership of Greenland. Right title and ownership, as he put it. Anything less was unacceptable. He threatened military force. He threatened economic warfare. He portrayed himself as unstoppable. Europe called his bluff, deploying forces and preparing for the worst, making clear they would invoke Article 5 of NATO if the United States attacked Greenland, which would mean the United States at war with its own alliance. Trump looked at that scenario and realized he had no good options. He couldn't invade without triggering catastrophic crisis. He couldn't impose tariffs without devastating the American economy, and he couldn't walk away without losing face. So he negotiated what diplomats are calling a face-saving compromise. The framework isn't about ownership, but involves enhanced security arrangements that were already in place, mineral development that Greenland has been seeking for years, and coordination on Arctic defense that NATO has been discussing for months. In other words, Trump is getting what the United States already had, packaged as a new deal so he can claim victory. And critically, he backed away from the military threat. During his Davos speech, Trump said the U.S. is seeking immediate negotiations to acquire Greenland but won't use force. For weeks, he refused to rule out military action. Now, with the world watching, he ruled it out. That's retreat, no matter how you frame it. The Danish response was diplomatic but firm. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen appeared to support Rutte and the outcome of his meeting with Trump, but insisted Denmark cannot negotiate on its sovereignty. A NATO spokesperson stated that the Secretary General did not propose any compromise to sovereignty during his meeting with the president in Davos. The message was clear. Cooperation, yes. Territorial surrender, never. But the significance here goes beyond Greenland. It's about why Trump backed down and what that reveals about changing power dynamics. For decades, American presidents could make demands and expect compliance, not through force, but through the weight of American economic and military dominance. The rules-based order Carney described wasn't actually based on rules. It was based on American hegemony. The U.S. wrote the rules, enforced them selectively, and expected deference. Allies accepted American leadership because benefits outweighed costs. The U.S. protected sea lanes, provided nuclear deterrence, anchored the global financial system. In exchange, allies gave Washington significant leeway. That bargain is breaking down. Greenland is the moment where it became impossible to ignore. Trump assumed he could bully Denmark the way previous presidents might have. He assumed threats would produce compliance. He assumed Europe would prioritize its relationship with Washington over principles of sovereignty. He was wrong. And Carney had predicted exactly this outcome the day before. Carney explained that when countries only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, they negotiate from weakness and accept what's offered, competing with each other to be the most accommodating, which is not sovereignty, but the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. Europe looked at Trump's threats and realized they couldn't rely on American restraint, so they acted. They deployed forces, they coordinated responses, they demonstrated that middle powers, when unified, can constrain a superpower. This is the rupture Carney was describing, not just the end of the old order, but the birth of something new. A world where American presidents can't simply demand compliance, where alliances operate on reciprocity rather than hierarchy, where sovereignty matters even for small nations when larger ones stand with them. The irony is that Trump's behavior accelerated this shift. His threats to Greenland did more to unite Europe than any policy paper could achieve. His tariff threats pushed NATO allies closer together. His disrespect for international law made rules-based frameworks more attractive by comparison. Carney understood this. That's why his speech resonated. He wasn't nostalgic for the old order. He acknowledged its flaws openly, but he argued that middle powers could build something better, not by confronting great powers directly, but by cooperating with each other, by pooling sovereignty where it made sense, by creating networks of mutual support that could resist coercion. Now consider what this means going forward. Trump's framework deal doesn't resolve anything fundamental. As of Thursday evening, there was no pen to paper, no deal on the table, and nothing has been agreed to, according to multiple sources familiar with the discussions. Denmark and Greenland have made clear they're not ceding sovereignty. The details of enhanced cooperation remain vague. And Trump has a track record of abandoning agreements when they become inconvenient. This could flare up again, especially if Trump feels humiliated by how this played out. He declared victory, but everyone paying attention saw what actually happened. He threatened. Europe unified, he backed down, but something fundamental has changed. Europe now knows it can stand up to American pressure. NATO allies have demonstrated they will defend each other even against threats from Washington. Middle powers have seen that coordination works, that precedent matters. It changes calculations. The next time Trump issues demands, allies will remember that resistance is possible, that unity provides protection, that sovereignty can be defended. And this doesn't just affect U.S.-Europe relations, it affects how every nation thinks about power. If Europe can resist American pressure over Greenland, what does that mean for Asia, for Latin America, for any region where Washington has traditionally expected deference? The economic implications are enormous. Markets hate uncertainty. When the president threatens military action against allies, investors move capital. Supply chains get reassessed, risk premiums increase. U.S. stocks, which fell on Tuesday as U.S.-Europe trade tensions escalated, recovered part of their lost value after Trump's framework announcement. But that relief was temporary. Investors now understand that Trump's approach creates volatility, and volatility has costs. Companies considering expanding U.S. operations are reconsidering. Trading partners negotiating deals are hedging. Allies that provided diplomatic support are calculating whether alignment with Washington is worth the risk. This erosion of trust happens slowly, then suddenly. Once lost, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. European leaders understand this. That's why Macron and others have been so vocal. They're not just defending Denmark, they're defending the principle that threats don't work, that sovereignty matters, that alliances require mutual respect, and Carney gave them a framework for thinking about this moment not as tragedy, but as opportunity. The old order is gone. Nostalgia won't bring it back. But from the rupture, we can build something better, stronger, more just. That message resonated because it offered a path forward. Not resistance for its own sake, but the construction of new arrangements. Coalitions built on shared values rather than domination. Cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchy. The contrast with Trump's vision couldn't have been starker. Trump sees the world as zero-sum, winners and losers, dominance or submission. Strength measured in the ability to extract concessions through threats. Carney sees interdependence, shared challenges requiring collective solutions, strength measured in the capacity to build coalitions and maintain them. One vision is rooted in the past, the other looks toward what comes next. And at Davos, the world saw both visions on display. One day apart, same venue, same audience, completely different approaches. Carney spoke to the future. Trump revealed his limitations, the demonstration that American power has limits, that threats can fail, that allies can resist, that middle powers, when unified, can constrain even a superpower. Trump went to Davos seeking to project dominance over Greenland. He left having retreated from his most extreme demands. He declared victory, but everyone watching saw what actually happened. The coming months will reveal whether Trump's framework holds or whether this crisis reignites, whether Europe maintains its unity or fractures under pressure, whether the precedent set at Davos becomes a turning point or a temporary blip. But one thing is already clear. The world order is changing, not through grand agreements or dramatic summits, but through moments like this, when threats fail, when allies stand firm, when leaders like Carney articulate what everyone is thinking but afraid to say. And when history looks back at this week in Davos, it won't remember Trump's framework deal. It will remember the Canadian Prime Minister who told the world the truth, that their old order is over, that nostalgia won't save us, and that from the fracture, if we have the courage to build together, something better might emerge.